Hi, this is Latifah Saafir, and I'm very, very honored to have an exhibit this year at the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. When I was first asked to put an exhibit at the museum of my collected work over the years, I was a little bit hesitant because of the fact that none of these quilts were ever made to be shown in a museum, and I've never entered quilts into shows. They really are either made to get that idea out of my head, or just like as a personal exploration of getting the joy of having the joy of making this quilt, or as part of support for a product line in my business. And in a lot of ways, those two are very connected at this point in my life. And so sometimes I question whether or not these quilts were even museum worthy, if that makes any sense. I also wanted to make a few special new quilts for the exhibit, and the past year was just very, very hectic, and that didn't happen either. So at the end of the day, I picked 20 quilts that I think collectively represent a really good cross-section of my work. There's a couple quilts that I vacillated on whether or not they should go in, and I'll talk about those as well. The NQM staff asked if I could chat a little bit with you, go into a little bit of a deeper dive into some aspect of either prepping for the show or the show itself. And I'm going to actually talk about some of the quilts that I think are pretty significant. And then in some ways they're significant not only in my journey, but the journey of the modern quilt movement and my role that I've played in that as well. So let's just go ahead and dive in and talk about quilts. So the first quilt that I'm going to talk about is, actually, let me back up really quick. Before I do that, a little bit about my journey as a quilter. I started quilting in 2009, and I have a tendency to dive in head first with things. So 2009 was also the year that I co-founded the Modern Quilt Guild through the founding of the very first chapter, which was the Los Angeles Modern Quilt Guild. And I didn't have to learn to sew to quilt. I've been sewing kind of my whole life, but I had to learn all the quilt specific things. And it's been a really amazing journey ever since. So one of the quilts that I finished to show in my very first Los Angeles Modern Quilt Guild meeting is this black and white stunner that I call the Big Log. The Big Log, it's a log cabin. It's based on the log cabin process, the way that it's built. I built these logs improvisational based on one inch finished black strips, so 1.5 inch black strips, and just a white background fabric. And I improv pieced each of the logs and then sewed them into place. That's basically how it was constructed. I started sort of pushing what I was taught from my very earliest quilts, and you can see a lot of that in my work currently and how I teach and things as well. But you'll see that big chunky binding, which is kind of a theme you see on a couple of quilts in the exhibit as well. And I just could not see putting a standard quilt binding. You know, most of the tutorials, that was the time when we learned online a lot, and most of the tutorials told you cut out your fabric, your strip of fabric 2¼ inches or 2½ inches, and and I decided from this quilt on that binding would be a design decision, and that's kind of how I approach it. And so I struggled and fought and kind of cried a little bit and trying to figure out how to miter the corners with 1-inch binding. And that's one of my most popular tutorials online to this day. And so I really, really love this quilt. Let me tell you why I think it's really hilarious that it's in this exhibit, and that's probably because it's the worst free motion quilted quilt in my whole collection, because it was one of the very first as well. So I was sewing on a little bitty small Kenmore machine. I was determined to get this done. I have the locking stitch that you have on machines on the back, all completely on the back where I did starts and stops. Nothing is buried. My stitch length is irregular. But what I love about, and this is one of my favorite quilts, one of the things I love about it is the fact that it is imperfect. And if I never had this quilt, then I would never made all the rest of the quilts in the collection. And, at that point in time, as a serial crafter who had so many unfinished projects, my only goal was to finish these quilts, was to put the binding on. So this is one of my favorite quilts and probably will be in my forever collection. The next quilt we'll talk about, and we'll talk about this kind of as a group of quilts, is going to be the series of Glam Clam quilts that you'll see in the exhibit. I chose to put 3 Glam Clam quilts and 1 pieced Glam Clam that's called Callaloo in this exhibit for a very specific reason. They're pretty meaningful to me in my journey as a quilt maker. Back in 2010 maybe is when I decided I want to make a clamshell quilt. And most of the tutorials at that time, clamshell quilts were the traditionally hand-pieced clamshells, where your clamshells were a couple of inches in diameter and you're hand sewing them. And since I don't love hand sewing that much, and I wanted to make it like a bolder statement with them, I automatically decided to blow them up. And that one quilt, the neon and neutral, the one that I'm showing now, this one quilt has taken me on a journey. I swear I'll be teaching Glam Clam quilts until I'm 80, and I'm absolutely okay with that because it's such a classic shape. I didn't invent clamshells, but I did approach it in a new, fresh way that introduced clamshell quilts to hopefully many, many generations to come. I love the fact that I hear Glam Clam used interchangeably with clamshell quilts, and it's almost a generic term right now, which is really, really a fun thing. It also took me on a journey as a tool and template designer as well. So from that I developed the Clammy template, which is shaped like a clamshell, but it can cut. My theory is that it can cut any shape that's based on a full circle. And so far we figured out apple core, double wedding rings, and then these overlapping circles, and like lots of other fun things as well. So, and I'm super excited about what the future can hold with the Clammy. And this is kind of the product line that started my whole business. So the second clamshell quilt is called One Dog Night, and I almost didn't include this in exhibit because of the fact that it's very similar to design choices and things intentionally as neon and neutral. But the reason why I did is because I wanted you all to see the absolutely stunning quilting and how quilting can make all the difference. It's done by a dear, dear friend, Christine Perigo, who passed a few years ago. We lost a great one. But Christine was magical with machine quilting, with custom computerized machine quilting. And this is definitely another quilt in my forever collection. I think those first 3 quilts are all in my forever collection. And I treasure this quilt so much because it's the voice of one artist laid on top of the voice of another artist, and it just created magic in ways that I couldn't have done on my own. Absolutely love it. The third Glam Clam quilt in the collection is called Cotton Candy Dreams. It was quilted by Christy Ryan. And I also, when I give a quilter my quilts, I will give them very few limitations. Like, I don't love contrasting thread on quilts generally. So usually I'll say, make the thread blend and have at it. And Christy Ryan definitely put a beautiful, beautiful twist on Glam Clam as well. So that took me on a whole journey, and you won't be able to see it, but some of the other quilts in the exhibit were also made with different size clammies as well. So love, love, love the whole journey that took me on. What should I talk about next? Oh, I know what. One of my very earliest other quilts is called Convergence. The pattern ended up being one of my very first patterns. This was called No Latitude. And it was one of the first quilts on my journey in playing with bias tape applique. I have a couple that I'm sharing in the exhibit, but it's really, really, I think it's stunning. It's really, really more stunning in person, even though it's been photographed a lot, shown in a number of books and things. But I really wanted bias tape to be the main element on the quilt. And also, not loving handwork, I also wanted to include top stitching as a detail as well. So both sides of the bias tape are top stitched down. Literally the design is drawn onto the background fabric. I may have used a Sharpie, shh, don't tell anybody. And you know, and I was just playing with experimenting with using different size bias strips. So Convergence is one. There's another quilt in the exhibit that's called the Big O Part 2, and that has 1 and 2 inch bias strips in it as well. And there's a couple other quilts in the exhibit that use bias tape applique as well. And this is another one of those I didn't develop the technique at all. We know bias tape applique has been used since quilting was invented, probably. But I did approach it a lot differently, and I believe that I've had a little bit of influence on how bias tape applique has been explored, especially in the modern quilt community, which I love, love, love. And I mean, there's so many quilts in this exhibit that are meaningful to me for many, many reasons. I think I probably have 4. I'm looking at, if you're wondering what I'm looking at, I have a little printout here of a lot of the images of the quilts from the exhibit. So there's probably 4 or 5 quilts in the exhibit itself that actually use bias tape applique that I really, really, really love. Okay, so what's next? Another one of my quilts that I really, really love is a quilt that was also quilted by Christy Ryan. This quilt is called Crush Groove, and I was inspired to make this quilt. Now, the funny thing is, you know, none of these shapes were invented, you know, but we take these ideas that we see from different places and pull them together, and then we're influenced by other things, and they all come together to make beautiful quilts for us. So I initially had, you know, this sort of ring around a center circle, large scale, and my I sketch on my computer for many, many years. And one day I'm going to do something with that. And then I saw a quilt that was in an antique quilt collection that had orange centers and had these really irregular rings with irregular design or no rhythm inside of sort of the pattern, like more of an improv placement of the spokes within the ring. And I was like, oh my God, this is what this quilt needs to be. And it took me on this whole journey of making a quilt pattern that I call glare quilt. This one here, the one that's in the show, and red is really hard to photograph. So when you see it in this show, it's so much more stunning in person. Hopefully you get to see it. But this quilt here is sort of my love song to the original quilt that inspired like the really random improv layouts of the rings. And I love this quilt in person. Christy also quilted this for me as well. This may also be in my forever collection as well. The colors, that was when Kona Crush was the color of the year, so I use that for the centers. The greens around the ring, there's a whole story about me and green because I was forced to wear green school uniforms as a child the few years that I went to private school, and I thought I hated it, but it turns out that I love it, so I love to throw green at my work now. And then a particular series of prints by Rashida Coleman Hale that I swear that she designed exactly for me. That's sprinkled in as well, very light prints. And then Christy's quilting on top of it. And this quilt right here is just really, really has my heart. This pattern has my heart. So I want to show you really quick one of the quilts that did not make it for the exhibit. I'm going to show you on screen. I have it right here by me. This quilt actually lives on my couch. I love it. It gets used. One of the reasons why I chose not to put it in the exhibit is because it has Minky on the background, and I chose to put a pantograph, have it quilted, long arm quilted with a pantograph, because I really wanted this like chain link fence design on the front of it. But it's my hip hop t-shirt quilt, also made with the glare pattern. And I thought it would be first hilarious to have a t-shirt quilt at the National Quilt Museum, and second, the fact that it's a hip hop t-shirt quilt, which is like pairs two loves of my life. But I chose not to for a couple of reasons, and I'm okay with it. But I thought I would throw that in right there. So you guys almost got to see a t-shirt quilt at the National Quilt Museum. Probably not the first time either, but I thought it would have been a fun sort of addition to my exhibit, which I chose not to do. In any case, what else do we have here? I like sort of extrapolating on ideas. So we take one idea and that creates something else, and it creates something else. And I'm forever, and I know I'm not the only one, but taking pictures of when I'm out in the world of things that inspire me in my quilting. So walking with a family down Las Vegas Boulevard, and I stopped the whole group, and I'm taking pictures of the ground because I see this, I believe it's called a European fans. It's a stonework pattern that is a pretty classic pattern that's gone back probably thousands of years, and you see it in ancient architecture and so on and so forth. And I came home and I'm like, oh, that needs to be a quilt. And it became my quilt that's known as Molehills. And Molehills originally started off with very similar to that stonework pattern, which each arc had individual pieces in it. And then it became this quilt here. I named this quilt, it's just called Blue Molehills, so it doesn't have a fancy name. I guess maybe it never inspired me to create a name with it, but it's one of the very early Molehills quilts. It actually was quilted years after it was actually pieced. It sat in my quilt closet, unfinished object closet for many years. Christy also quilted this one for me. And I love this quilt for so many reasons. My engineering brain, I have a mechanical engineering degree. My engineering brain loves to see the finished result and then to work its way back into how that's going to go together. And it's all about streamlining the process. So all of these fans go together with one fan shape that's either cut in half vertically or horizontally to fill in the top and bottom and the sides. And that curve is based on an oval now and not a circle. So this is not a clammy quilt. That oval shape is actually so gentle that it's great for beginners to learn on. So there's so many beautiful Molehills quilts out in the world, and I really think that this is another sort of significant quilt in my collection. It was my first printed pattern that actually was like printed in a booklet form, even though Glam Clam was my first like PDF. And I recently, 2 years ago now, actually updated the whole pattern, developed an acrylic template that I was really happy about to make it as well. But the quilt sort of took a life on its own, like so many different iterations of that quilt came into being. So I'm going to show you two other quilts from the exhibit that were sort of the original inspiration was that stonework pattern that so many of us have either driven across or walked across or seen on a building, and that became inspiration for that. So the first one is, we started off with each arc with the individual pieces in it, very similar to that stonework pattern, and then we did just the single arcs on their own, and then from there we cut out the full fan. And then from the full fan, we threw improv at it. And from that, you get Muddy Waters, which is a small baby quilt made out of that. And I love the surprise in this quilt. The thing that I think that, it's the little things sometimes, the little details. But I wanted to do like an improv-y sort of a binding on it. And it has a chunky binding on this quilt as well. But I wanted to throw bits and pieces of the improv fabric that I used in the improv fans inside of the binding. But some of those fabrics were this really open weave fabric. And once I put it in the binding, I'm like, oh yeah, that's not going to wear well at all. So I went back and did quilting on top of those pieces just on the binding. And so those fun surprises, I think, really make a difference in a quilt. And then we have Pickled Beets, and Pickled Beets has these dramatic oval arcs that go across the whole width of the quilt, but this is the same shape that Molehills is based off of. So one of my go-to design decisions is always going to be go big, and so this one definitely is a go big. So we did foundation paper piecing to get those nice sharp points, because the triangle does change because it's based on an oval and not a circle. But it's a really I love this quilt because I think in person it really does stand out, and it's really fun. What's next? Go big, design decision. So this particular quilt, I don't remember all of the names of all of my quilts, and I think I named this one. I have my my list here. You Got Me, and You Got Me it's just this. First of all, I mentioned go big because when I designed the Clammys, the originals were in a 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch. Then I did a layer cake Clammy that's 9-inch. And then in my passion to always go big, that's always the answer to the question is to go big. I thought, what if I did a 24-inch Clammy, which is huge. You guys want to see it? Let me grab it really quick. That, my friends, is the 24-inch Clammy. It's crazy, right? So in my, I thought, this is a really huge template. It's a little ridiculous. It's kind of awesome. And I've had so much fun creating with this template because of the fact that it's so big and it's so bold, it is so in your face. And so this little 48-inch square baby quilt with rounded corners is log cabins and just this one template cutting full circles out. And it's something about the simplicity of the log cabins, or like that really grounded, log cabins are like our grounding quilt block, right? And so something about those log cabins and then superimposed into these circles in a really, really simple background that I think makes this quilt really simple, but yet very, very stunning as well. So you'll see that go big a lot in a lot of elements in my quilts. That's a lot of the quilts that you'll see in the exhibit. There is one improv quilt, two improv quilts that are actually inspired from Sherry Lynn Wood's work. And these are two quilts that I love because I learned through them that it's okay to sort of trust in your own voice, right? Because of the fact that one was started in a class with Sherry, and I went into this class with all of these expectations about coming out with this amazing Sherry Lynn Wood's quilt that I was going to make, and it was going to be so amazing. And 2-day class, at the end of day one, I realized that I was having these, instead of this like really flowy improv shapes and things, that I had perfect circles coming out, even though they were improv cut and pieced. And it just was my brain screaming through like, this is who you are. And so then I decided to take a deep dive into this is who I am, and sort of pieced it into this regularly rectangular background, and it's actually pieced into the background. It's not applique on top. And it ended up being a favorite quilt of mine. And I call it Running Away. All of my names, most of my quilt names actually have sort of a story behind it. But there's a Bob Marley song that says you're running and you're running and you're running away, but you can't run away from yourself. That was my lesson in that quilt. And then the other quilt, Sherry actually asked me to follow her sort of score, and make these bias petals and create this quilt in the background. And it's also another one of my favorites. I think is really well done. And even though I use the inspiration of her, her guidance from her score, then the quilt definitely has the Latifah element 100% in it, within that sort of framework as well. So those are most of my quilts for the exhibit. The one quilt that apparently wasn't supposed to be remade is a quilt that I designed for the family of Stephen Taylor. It was a fourth quilt that was where one quilt was supposed to be made as a memory quilt for the family. He was killed in an incident of gun violence. And I made one quilt for his grandmother who raised him, Grandma Addie, who's now my Grandma Addie too. And that one quilt became 3 because I found out he had 2 sons. So I made a quilt for each of them, all using his shirts. Then I had this pile left over of denim, mostly jeans with the holes in the knees and the whole 9. You know what the style is nowadays. And I knew something needed to be made out of it. So I made this quilt that's ended up being called We Still Matter. And I gifted that as well to the family. So Grandma Annie has that as well. And I once almost asked her to have it shown in the show, and it just didn't feel right to ask her. So I wanted to recreate a version of that, and I started on it. And apparently it wasn't supposed to show at this exhibit. So hopefully I will be able to finish that, and it will show in the world at future events as well. So I hope you all are able to come see the exhibit at the National Quilt Museum. I'd love to hear feedback on this small body of work that just reflects, me, sort of a mixture of me like having these ideas that I want to see come to life about how things fit together and form and function. And then also a lot of quilts that really support my work as a creative in the business side of this world as well, and bringing products to life and that type of thing as well. So thank you so much for letting me ramble just a bit today about one of my favorite topics, which is quilts, and tell you a little bit of backstory about some of the quilts that hopefully you'll get a chance to see in the exhibit. But thank you so much. Take care.